A single mistake can change your entire life in the blink of an eye, especially when you're too blinded by hatred to see who stands before you. In a bustling courtroom in the heart of Georgia, a cocky police officer named Wayne Rogers smirks at the man who just days before he'd humiliated on the side of the road. Little does he know, that very man, an unassuming black citizen who drives a modest car and keeps his calm in the face of aggression, is the Honorable Judge Marcus Brown, the man presiding over the biggest corruption case this city has ever witnessed. It was a humid August morning in Pinebridge, Georgia. Thick layers of sunshine poured onto the cracked sidewalks, making the day feel even hotter than it was. Locals bustled along Main Street, some heading for a quick coffee run at the Starbucks that had opened there a few months ago, others picking up groceries or chatting beneath the old oak tree in front of the courthouse. Pinebridge was a modest town, the sort where everyone seemed to know everyone else, though that was not always a comfort. Rumors traveled fast, and small-town politics could be as stifling as the summer heat. Marcus Brown's tidy sedan pulled into the worn parking lot behind the courthouse, a brick building that had stood the test of centuries. Having been erected right after the Civil War, the American flag fluttered on its pole out front, a symbol of unity that, like the old building, had survived decades of history, both dignified and shameful. Marcus had grown up only 2 hours away in Macon, attending Tuskegee University later for his undergraduate degree in criminal justice, a decision that would lay the groundwork for his entire life. A stout older woman with a welcoming smile, Miss Delphine, greeted Marcus as he stepped out of his car. Miss Delphine had been the courthouse custodian since before Marcus was born, and for many in Pinebridge, she was the true living archive of this place. If you wanted to know who was feuding with whom, or which official might secretly be under investigation for something, all you had to do was have a friendly chat with her. "Good morning, Judge Brown," she chirped, a mop in hand. "Hot one, ain't it?" "Yes, it is," he said, carefully removing his sunglasses and offering her a polite nod. "But I'll take the heat over a storm any day. How are you this fine morning, Miss Delphine?" "Oh, I'm good. Heard some rumblings about that big corruption case. They say it's about to get real interesting round here." Marcus smiled gently, but there was an uneasy flutter in his chest. As Pinebridge's newest Superior Court judge, he had landed a case that came with a labyrinth of political tension, allegations of police misconduct, bribery, and tampering with evidence. Rumors pointed toward multiple officers' names he'd heard whispered in corridors, but so far, none of them were confirmed in the official file. Marcus had no illusions, however. He'd seen enough in his years, as both a defense attorney and a prosecutor, to know that where there's smoke, there's often a raging fire beneath. He gave Miss Delphine a gentle smile. "We'll see how it goes, Miss Delphine. I hope justice can be served." She nodded and continued on her way, the wheels of her cleaning bucket squeaking across the pavement. Marcus inhaled the sticky August air, letting the sun beat down on his face for a moment. A new day, a new chapter. He had only been on the bench for 7 months, a swift rise after a stellar career in the district attorney's office and a short but prominent stint as a public defender. This role was more than a job to him, it was his life's calling. He remembered being a little boy in Macon, listening to his father talk about the deep systemic injustices faced by black people in the South. Now, decades later, he was in a position to tip the scales of justice, even if only slightly. Checking his watch, Marcus made his way into the courthouse. Each footstep on the marble floors echoed with authority. Unbeknownst to him, life was about to tilt dramatically in a matter of days, starting from a simple incident on a dusty side street that would not just test his moral code, but also Pinebridge's entire notion of law, order, and decency. Marcus's journey to that marble-floored hallway had been anything but straightforward. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood of Macon, he was the middle child among 5 siblings. His parents both worked long hours, his mother as a schoolteacher, his father as a mechanic at a local auto shop. Times were often tough. Bills would pile up on the kitchen table, leading to hushed arguments late at night when the children were supposed to be asleep. Yet, despite financial struggles, there was always plenty of love in their home. Marcus's mother would read to them every evening stories about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. His father would come home with grease stains on his hands and talk about pride, respect, and the value of an honest day's labor. The moral framework they instilled never left Marcus. Throughout high school, Marcus was a curious soul. He spent time reading legal thrillers in the library when others were shooting hoops after school. He was fascinated by how the law could become both a sword and a shield, how it could cut down oppression but also defend the vulnerable. When he got accepted into Tuskegee University, his parents beamed with pride, though they couldn't afford the tuition on their own. Marcus balanced multiple part-time jobs, including working at a local bookstore and serving as a campus security guard. Those grueling years taught him how the law exists, not in the abstract, but in the everyday hustle of real people's lives. After Tuskegee, law school in Atlanta beckoned. There, he found himself confronting discrimination firsthand, even if it was subtle side glances in upscale neighborhoods. Security guards following him in stores, prospective employers who seemed surprised at his polished speech or high GPA. Still, he pushed forward, graduating near the top of his class. He quickly passed the bar and began his career as an assistant public defender, working long hours in a cramped, underfunded office. He came face to face with an unkind reality. The legal system tilted heavily against the people he represented. Discriminatory policing practices, mandatory minimum sentencing, and racially biased juries were not only real, but they were painfully prevalent. Later, Marcus switched to the prosecutor's office, hoping to tackle injustice from within. The irony was not lost on him. On one side of the aisle, he had tried to protect the accused. On the other side, he worked to convict them. But he wasn't the kind of prosecutor to toss people behind bars for trivial infractions. Instead, he sought to carefully weigh facts, urging rehabilitation for first-time offenders and pushing for fairness in sentencing. That nuanced approach earned him respect from judges, though it didn't always win him fans among law and order hardliners. But he believed in what he was doing. When a local seat for Superior Court judge opened in Pinebridge, Marcus's record and reputation catapulted him onto the short list. It was a leap, a relocation, but a dream come true, a chance to fundamentally shape how justice was administered in a small but significant jurisdiction. Throughout all this, an undercurrent of adversity remained. He had seen how power could corrupt even the most well-intentioned individuals. He had watched small-town police chiefs operate like warlords, abusing their badges to keep entire neighborhoods under fear. He had encountered so-called good cops, who turned a blind eye to their colleagues' misconduct out of misplaced loyalty. And he had argued cases before judges who appeared more concerned with their local social circles than the merits of each case. Pinebridge was not wholly exempt from these ills, but it carried a certain promise. It was close enough to Atlanta to feel the progressive ripple effects, but far enough to maintain a slower, more community-based lifestyle. Marcus hoped that, in Pinebridge, he could finally exercise the fair-minded jurisprudence he dreamed of. That's why the upcoming corruption case was so important to him. If even a fraction of the rumors were true, then certain members of the Pinebridge Police Department were involved in a massive scandal that ranged from pocketing bribes from local businesses to planting evidence on suspects. Little did Marcus know that among the names swirling in the rumor mill was a particular officer, a man whose path would soon cross his in the most explosive way possible. That man, Wayne Rogers, was already living on borrowed time, his sense of invincibility fueled by unchallenged years of misconduct. Officer Wayne Rogers considered himself the unassailable face of Pinebridge law enforcement. He was a towering figure, with a chest puffed out like a rooster and a perpetual sneer etched onto his face. At 45 years old, he had spent over 2 decades in the Pinebridge Police Department, PPD. Over the years, he had cultivated relationships with powerful figures in the local government, in part by turning a blind eye to their questionable dealings, and in part by ensuring that certain allegations never made it to the public ear. Most of the people in Pinebridge who had run-ins with Rogers despised him, but they also feared him. He had a reputation. If Rogers didn't like you, you might find yourself pulled over for going 1 mile over the speed limit. Or your nephew might face harassment if he so much as spat on a public sidewalk. He was the kind of officer who thrived on intimidation and meticulously orchestrated random checks. There was a rumor that Rogers kept a notebook of undesirables, people he believed deserved special attention. And if you were black or Hispanic or otherwise didn't fit Rogers's mold of decent folks, your name could wind up in that notebook for no reason at all. Beyond the rumors, Rogers's racist leanings were not exactly hidden. Subtle jabs, questionable remarks that teetered on the edge of bigotry, and jokes at the expense of marginalized communities were part of his daily routine inside the station. There had been minor complaints lodged against him, but they always disappeared. People in town whispered that Rogers had powerful friends who made those problems vanish. Unsurprisingly, Rogers was also rumored to be at the center of the corruption scandal that had Pinebridge buzzing. Allegations included accepting bribes from local gambling rings, tampering with evidence, and forcing coerced confessions out of vulnerable suspects. But none of these had ever made it into a courtroom. Witnesses were too scared to come forward, or, if they did, they later recanted in the face of intimidation. Rogers strutted around as though he were untouchable. Yet, beneath the bravado, Rogers had his own insecurities. He was painfully aware that the new judge, Marcus Brown, was a rising star and had a reputation for being a stickler for justice. Rogers knew enough about the looming corruption case to suspect that, eventually, names would start dropping. And if his name came up, he wondered whether the network of protection he had built over decades would be enough to keep him safe. Still, like most bullies, Rogers pushed forward with his usual tactics, clinging to the hope that intimidation and status would carry him through. He'd never actually met Marcus Brown in person, but he'd heard the gossip around town. The new judge was black, he was young, and rumor had it he was a bleeding heart when it came to civil rights. Rogers scoffed at the idea. In his mind, no black man, certainly not one from somewhere else, should have the kind of power Marcus did. Quietly, Rogers resented Marcus. He felt that men like him were turning the world upside down, championing accountability in a system Rogers believed should favor men in uniform no matter what. And so it was only a matter of time before these two polar opposites collided. The precise moment would come soon, at a random intersection in Pinebridge where Rogers was conducting one of his typical traffic sweeps. It would happen with almost comedic timing, a collision of fate that would set the entire town ablaze with controversy, gossip, and some much-deserved comeuppance. Meanwhile, Rogers strolled through the station locker room, adjusting his bulletproof vest and checking his reflection in the mirror. He always prided himself on looking sharp. It was part of his intimidation tactic. He ran a hand over his neatly trimmed beard, exhaled, and muttered under his breath, "Nobody's taking me down, especially not some new hotshot judge." He grabbed his cruiser keys, stepped outside, and squinted against the intense sun. The day was already sweltering, With a loud slam of the squad car's door, he set off to patrol the streets of Pine Bridge. Whether by fate, coincidence, or the workings of karma, he would soon find himself face to face with the very man whose future decisions could shape the rest of his life. A few days later, in the late afternoon, Marcus wrapped up his last hearing of the day. A relatively simple case, a burglary with no injuries, had been postponed due to a key witness's absence. Marcus was looking forward to heading home, kicking off his shoes and cooling down in the air-conditioned comfort of his modest, suburban house. The day had been exhaustingly hot, the kind where sweat gathers in the small of your back after just a few minutes outside. He decided to take a route through a less congested part of town to avoid the usual late-day traffic. It was a narrower street with older homes, some in decent shape, others with peeling paint and sagging porches. It was also the kind of street that the Pine Bridge Police Department frequently patrolled, claiming it was a high crime zone. Marcus, remembering his days as a public defender, took that classification with a grain of salt. Sometimes a so-called high crime area was simply a predominantly black neighborhood that the police kept under heavy scrutiny. As he drove, Marcus was careful to keep his speed just below the 30 mph limit. Despite being a judge, he was not in the mood to deal with a speeding ticket or, worse, the headache of explaining himself. Nonetheless, he spotted flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. His heart dropped, a familiar anxiety creeping in. Every black man in America, regardless of status, knows that a police stop can escalate from mundane to life-threatening in a heartbeat. Marcus signaled and pulled over. He inhaled deeply, reminding himself, "Stay calm, you've done nothing wrong." He watched in his side mirror as a tall officer with a smug expression sauntered toward him. Marcus rolled down his window. "License and registration," the officer barked. He wore a name badge that read Rogers. Marcus nodded politely. "Certainly, officer," he said, his voice steady, though his heart thumped. He retrieved his license from his wallet and pulled the registration from the glove compartment. Rogers eyed the documents with a thinly veiled look of disdain. "You aware of why I pulled you over?" "Not entirely, officer," Marcus replied, trying to remain composed. "I believe I was driving within the speed limit." Rogers let out a dry laugh. "Your brake light is flickering. That's a violation, you know." Marcus blinked. He'd checked his car just the other day and everything had been in order. Maybe the bulb had gone out. Or maybe Rogers was exaggerating. Either way, a flickering brake light hardly warranted the hostility in the officer's tone. "I wasn't aware of that," Marcus said carefully. "If it's out, I'll get it fixed right away." Rogers returned to his squad car, presumably to run the license and registration. This was standard procedure, but the tension was palpable. After what felt like an eternity, Rogers returned, lips twisted into something resembling a sneer. "Marcus Brown," he said, reading from the license in a mocking tone. "You live in Pine Bridge, do you?" "Yes, officer." "The first do." Rogers raised an eyebrow. "Says here your registration is new. Only been around a few months?" "That's correct," Marcus replied. "I moved here for work." Rogers grunted. "Work," he repeated, spitting the word like it tasted sour. "What kind of work brings someone like you to Pine Bridge?" Marcus felt a flicker of anger at the insinuation, but swallowed it down. "I work at the courthouse." Rogers chuckled. "Ah, a courthouse clerk, maybe. Fancy yourself a do-gooder, I see." His tone was dripping with condescension. "Well, guess what, Mr. Courthouse? This is a high crime area, and I'm within my rights to search your vehicle if I suspect anything." Marcus remained silent. He could feel the tension ratcheting higher. Rogers motioned for him to step out of the car, which Marcus did, mentally reminding himself that any show of resistance could escalate the situation further. At that moment, an older black woman in a nearby yard watched warily. her laundry basket in hand. Her gaze flicked between Rogers and Marcus, worry etched across her features. Rogers proceeded to do a cursory check, rifling through the interior of Marcus's sedan. He found nothing, of course, but that didn't stop him from taking his time, shining a flashlight under the seats and opening the glove compartment again and again. "All right," Rogers finally said, straightening his posture. "Maybe you're clean." His eyes flickered with a certain mean-spirited satisfaction. "Don't think I don't know your type. Come in from some liberal city, think you can waltz around here like you own the place. I'm the law in Pinebridge, get it? Next time I see you do anything, even roll through a stop sign, I'll make sure you regret it." Marcus's jaw tightened. He had to carefully weigh his words. "I appreciate you informing me about the brake light, Officer Rogers. If there's nothing else," Rogers interrupted, "don't push it. Now get back in your car and watch yourself." With that, he scribbled something on his notepad and tore off a slip. He slapped the paper against Marcus's chest. "A warning. Next time, it'll be a ticket or worse." Marcus took the warning citation with steady hands, though inside he felt a swirl of anger and humiliation. He knew that Rogers's behavior was part of the broader disease of racism and abuse of power. But for the moment, all he could do was comply. He slipped back into the driver's seat, started his car, and cautiously drove away. In the rear view, he watched Rogers stand there, arms folded, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Marcus drove the rest of the way home in silence, the incident weighing heavily on him. Though it stung to be treated like a criminal, there was a darker undercurrent. Wasn't Rogers rumored to be linked to the corruption case? Marcus recalled hearing that name recently during a briefing about the sealed charges. The realization made his throat go dry. In a matter of days or weeks, that same officer, who had just thoroughly humiliated him for no valid reason, might appear in his courtroom. When Marcus arrived home, he parked in his driveway, turned off the ignition, and simply sat there for a moment. He examined the warning citation. Rogers had jotted down defective brake light and suspicious vehicle. Marcus let out a slow, steady breath. He knew that if Rogers was indeed involved in the corruption case, this personal confrontation could make any upcoming legal proceedings incredibly tense and complicated. As a judge, Marcus had a professional duty to remain impartial, but he was also human. How could he remain neutral toward a man who had just brazenly harassed him on the side of the road? Yet, ironically, it was not Marcus who would have to reconcile the conflict. By law, Rogers would have to face accountability in Marcus's courtroom if the allegations turned into formal charges. Marcus thought back to the stories his father had told him about how to stand tall in the face of bigotry. This was the moment. He realized a moment to embody the justice he believed in, no matter how personal it might feel. The following week, inside Pinebridge's stately courthouse, the case that had been brewing for months was finally ready to be unveiled. The district attorney's office had prepared a string of evidence suggesting corruption in the police force. Though the case was under heavy wraps, rumors were swirling that one of the indicted officers was none other than Wayne Rogers. The local newspaper, the Pinebridge Herald, had run a speculative article titled "Police Corruption DA to Reveal Suspects This Week." The entire town waited with bated breath. Marcus arrived early that morning, wanting to review the case files one more time before the hearing. The large envelope from the district attorney's office listed the defendants by initials, not full names, to maintain secrecy until the indictment was formally unsealed. Marcus scanned the documents carefully, aware of how critical this case was. Bribery, false arrests, evidence planting, these were not minor infractions. If proven true, they could send an officer or multiple officers behind bars for a long time. His heart skipped a beat when he matched the initials WR with Wayne Rogers. He hadn't wanted to presume, but the sinking feeling he'd had since that roadside stop was now a concrete reality. Rogers was indeed at the center of it all. By mid-morning, the courtroom was crowded. Citizens packed the pews, a hush falling over the room that signaled the seriousness of the proceedings. Rogers was among several officers seated at the defense table, each flanked by their respective attorneys. From the bench, Marcus could see Rogers's face was ashen, but still held that trademark defiance. The tension was almost tangible. The district attorney, a tall woman named Cynthia Gray, stepped forward to present the charges. Judge Marcus Brown called the session to order, his voice clear. Court is now in session. This is the preliminary hearing for the state versus the defendants listed in case file 371C. Will the defendants please rise? Rogers and the other officers stood. A moment passed. Marcus could almost see the moment Rogers recognized him. There was a flicker in the officer's eyes, a sudden dawning horror. That man I harassed a week ago. He's the judge? Marcus returned Rogers's stunned gaze with professional calm. For the record, I am Judge Marcus Brown presiding over this case. The charges being brought forward include multiple counts of bribery, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and official misconduct. These are serious allegations, and each defendant is entitled to due process under the law. Rogers's attorney, a slick-looking man from a high-profile Atlanta law firm, spoke first. Your Honor, I'd like to request an immediate recusal. Given the circumstances, we believe there may be a conflict of interest. The courtroom murmured. Marcus felt every eye on him. He knew this was coming. Any competent defense attorney would suspect that Rogers might have compromised the judge's neutrality with the roadside confrontation. Yet, the law was very clear. A judge should recuse himself if there is a direct conflict that prevents impartiality. But the flip side was that Rogers harassing Marcus didn't automatically create a legal conflict. Indeed, many attorneys would argue Rogers's wrongdoing should not force the judge out. Rather, the judge must decide if he can remain fair. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice resonating through the silent room. Counsel, I understand your concern. Please state the nature of this alleged conflict of interest for the record. The attorney's lips pursed. Officer Rogers conducted a routine traffic stop involving Your Honor just last week. My client believes that the incident may color Your Honor's perception of him. Another ripple of whispers. Marcus let the tension hang in the air for a moment. Then he spoke. The traffic stop in question was minor and no charges were filed. I received a warning. The question for this court is whether that brief interaction impairs my ability to weigh the evidence fairly. I have taken an oath to administer justice impartially. The mere fact that I was pulled over for a defective brake light, whether accurately noted or not, does not automatically necessitate recusal. Marcus paused, leveling a steady gaze at Rogers, who was now sweating visibly. I assure you my duty to uphold the law supersedes any personal feelings about that incident. However, I will allow arguments from both parties to be heard on this issue. The defense may prepare a motion for recusal, and the prosecution will have an opportunity to respond. With that, the hearing proceeded. The district attorney laid out a preliminary summary of the evidence, internal memos hinting at hush money payments, recordings of phone calls that seemed to suggest tampering with evidence, and statements from several local business owners who claimed they had paid off officers for protection. Rogers was named specifically in multiple sections, allegedly acting as a ringleader. Marcus remained stoic, even as Rogers's face turned paler with each new piece of incriminating information. This was no small-time case. The charges, if proven, could lead to decades in prison. And the key suspect, the same man who had leaned into Marcus's car window with a sneer, was now feeling the weight of real justice on his shoulders. By the end of the hearing, the matter of recusal was left open. Marcus gave the defense a deadline of 1 week to file a formal motion. Court was adjourned. As the crowd filtered out, Rogers shot a last, seething glance at Marcus. There was a hint of disbelief there, mingled with fear. He might have thought he'd never face consequences for his actions, let alone from a man he had so recently and so brazenly harassed. But fate had twisted in a way that Rogers couldn't have anticipated, and in the hush of that majestic courtroom, it became clear that the era of his unchecked reign was drawing to a close. With the public indictment unsealed, Pinebridge buzzed with talk of corruption. The local diner became a hub for speculation. Folks sipped sweet tea and swapped theories about what else Rogers and his cohorts might have done. The Pinebridge Police Department was placed under intense scrutiny, with the mayor's office announcing a full internal review to restore public confidence. Meanwhile, in the courthouse, Judge Marcus Brown found himself wading through dense legal documents and testimonies. Even though the defense had filed a recusal motion, Marcus was still the presiding judge until or unless he chose to step down or a higher court ordered otherwise. He carefully examined each piece of evidence, determined not to let personal feelings cloud his judgment. In private moments, however, he couldn't help recalling Rogers's sneer, his arrogant posturing on that lonely street. If these allegations are true, Marcus thought, then that harassment is just the tip of the iceberg. Outwardly, Rogers tried to maintain a facade of confidence. He still wore his uniform when off duty, as though trying to broadcast his authority to everyone around him. But inside the station, whispers replaced the usual chatter. Some younger officers steered clear of him, unsure whether they'd be implicated if Rogers went down. Others glared openly, furious that he might tarnish the entire department's reputation. The chief of police, under pressure from the mayor, placed Rogers on administrative leave pending the outcome of the trial. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office ramped up its investigation. Cynthia Gray, heading the case, was resolute in her pursuit of evidence. She coordinated with state investigators and the FBI, who had taken an interest in the case given its potential to be part of a broader pattern of police corruption. Their findings only seemed to pile up more damning information against Rogers and the other indicted officers. Some of the most startling revelations came from a former officer who had left the department under suspicious circumstances. He offered up detailed accounts of Rogers's alleged ledger, a book containing notes on which local businesses had paid bribes, which individuals had been coerced into confessions, and even hush money distributions. Although no physical ledger had yet been recovered, the ex-officer's testimony was specific and credible. Marcus observed all of this from the judicial sidelines, aware that each new piece of evidence inched Rogers closer to a possible conviction. And with every passing day, Rogers's defense seemed to rely more heavily on personal attacks or procedural challenges rather than tangible facts. They insisted Rogers had been set up by disgruntled colleagues. They implied that the new judge's presence was a conflict from the start. Yet, none of these tactics addressed the growing mountain of proof. Behind the scenes, Miss Delphine, the courthouse custodian, confided in Marcus over a cup of coffee one morning. She told him how proud she was that Pinebridge might finally see justice. She had heard rumors about Rogers for years' harassment, planting contraband on young men he didn't like, extorting local shop owners. "I always prayed a day would come when someone stood up to him," she said softly, her eyes glossy with emotion. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the community's hope. "It's my role to ensure the process is fair," he replied carefully. "But I promise, if the evidence is there, justice will be served." In that moment, Marcus realized this case was bigger than him, bigger than Rogers. It was about setting a precedent, about proving that no one, regardless of a badge or uniform, is above the law. After a week of legal wrangling, Marcus denied the defense's motion for recusal. He penned a thorough, 12-page opinion citing precedents where judges had presided over cases despite having tangential encounters with the defendants. Marcus explained that while Rogers's behavior toward him was concerning, it did not impair his ability to remain impartial. The higher court upheld his decision, and the trial date was set. On the first day of the trial, the courthouse was a spectacle. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashed, and a crowd gathered hoping to secure a seat inside. Some carried signs condemning police corruption, others held up placards championing law and order, implying that Rogers was being unfairly targeted. The tension cut through the humid Georgia air like a razor. Marcus entered the courtroom, robe flowing, face composed. Jurors were selected amidst intense scrutiny from both sides. Each potential juror was grilled about their views on policing, corruption, and racial bias. In the end, a balanced panel of 12 men and women took their seats, each one looking solemnly aware of their civic duty. The district attorney, Cynthia Gray, opened with a commanding statement. She painted a picture of how corruption had taken root in the Pinebridge Police Department, describing Rogers as a seasoned officer who abused his influence to line his pockets and maintain power. She introduced the concept of the hush money ledger, naming local business owners who would testify they had paid Rogers to avoid unnecessary trouble. She assured the jury that evidence of intimidation tactics, forged documents, and manipulated body cam footage would be presented. Rogers's attorney countered with a narrative of a vendetta. He framed Rogers as a dedicated officer who had been set up by co-workers jealous of his decades on the force. He argued that the prosecution's witnesses were unreliable or had axes to grind. He also made veiled references to Marcus's traffic stop, hinting that the entire system was rigged against Rogers from the start. Witness after witness took the stand over the course of several days. Small business owners, some trembling with nerves, testified how Rogers demanded money in exchange for favorable law enforcement attention. One middle-aged bar owner recounted how she paid Rogers $500 a month to prevent random ID checks that always seemed to occur on her busiest nights. A mechanic described how Rogers threatened to plant stolen car parts in his shop if he didn't cooperate. The ex-officer who had initially tipped off investigators delivered the most damning account. He described secret meetings in the back of the police station where Rogers allegedly handed out hush money envelopes to other officers involved. Though he didn't have the physical ledger, he recalled specific transactions and dates. The prosecution bolstered his testimony with email logs showing suspiciously large cash deposits in Rogers's bank account following those exact dates. Throughout it all, Marcus maintained an air of measured authority, ensuring that each side was heard, that objections were properly argued, and that the jury had a clear view of the evidence. If he felt any personal anger toward Rogers, he never betrayed it on the bench. The only time their gazes met was when Rogers himself took the stand. With visible nerves, Rogers tried to downplay each accusation. He claimed that the bar owner had misunderstood his request for special detail. He denied ever threatening the mechanic. He suggested that the ex-officer was a disgruntled former employee fired for misconduct. But in cross-examination, Cynthia Gray meticulously dissected his statements, highlighting inconsistencies and confronting him with bank statements that showed large unexplained cash deposits over a period of years. Even the jury members seemed uneasy at the sheer volume of evidence stacking up. By the end of Rogers's testimony, beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. He glanced frequently at Marcus, perhaps seeking a hint of sympathy. He found none. When the prosecution rested, and then the defense followed suit, the jury was left to deliberate on a staggering range of charges. The tension was palpable. Rogers's fate now lay in the hands of 12 Pinebridge citizens, each forced to confront the question, would this town finally hold one of its most notorious lawmen accountable? Deliberations took 2 days. On the morning of the third day, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as people filed in, hearts pounding. Marcus took his seat, looking out at the sea of faces, some anxious, some hopeful, some resigned. Rogers stood at the defense table, his lawyer by his side. He stared at the floor, jaw clenched. The clerk read the verdicts one by one. Guilty on 2 counts of bribery. Guilty on 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct justice. Guilty on 1 count of official misconduct. The only charge on which he was acquitted was evidence tampering, owing to insufficient direct proof. Nonetheless, the avalanche of guilty verdicts made Rogers's knees buckle. Marcus watched him grimace, the color draining from his face. Marcus's voice broke the stunned silence. "Officer Wayne Rogers, you have been found guilty of multiple charges. Sentencing will occur 2 weeks from now. In the meantime, you will be remanded into custody without bail, given the severity of the crimes and risk of flight." There was a split second where Rogers seemed about to protest. His attorney laid a cautionary hand on his shoulder, and Rogers fell silent. The bailiffs approached to lead him away. As the crowd poured out of the courtroom, murmurs of relief and exclamations of shock mingled in the corridor. For Pinebridge, it was a monumental day, an acknowledgement that even the most powerful were not beyond the reach of the law. 2 weeks later, on the day of sentencing, the atmosphere was less frenzied but more somber. Rogers appeared in an orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the confident, uniformed officer who had once strutted the streets. Marcus read through the sentencing guidelines, factoring in Rogers's lack of remorse and the scope of his criminal enterprise. He then delivered the sentence. "Mr. Rogers, your actions have undermined the trust that this community places in its law enforcement officers. Therefore, on the charges of bribery and official misconduct, I hereby sentence you to a total of 15 years in state prison, along with a substantial fine. On the conspiracy charge, an additional 5 years served concurrently. Your time in uniform does not exempt you from accountability, and no one is above the law." With a gavel's sharp rap, it was sealed. Rogers was led away, head bowed. His swagger, once so pronounced, had vanished. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed for statements. Marcus offered a concise remark. "Justice has been served according to the evidence presented. I have full faith in the system's capacity to do what is right." Within days, other implicated officers took plea bargains or resigned from the department in disgrace. The Pinebridge Police Department underwent a thorough overhaul, and the mayor promised deeper reforms. For many in the community, a weight had been lifted. There was finally proof that the shield could not be used as a cover for corruption without consequences. In the quiet after the media storm, as Marcus sat in his office, he reflected on the chain of events. He thought back to that hot afternoon when Rogers had sneered down at him on the roadside. Fate had led them both to that moment of truth in the courtroom. The karmic balance had swung back with unwavering force, ensuring that a once untouchable man would learn that no amount of arrogance could shield him from the law. Once the dust settled, Pinebridge found itself at a crossroads. The police department's top brass had been exposed for harboring corrupt elements, and many officers who had turned a blind eye to Rogers's misdeeds struggled with shame. Town hall meetings erupted with citizens demanding transparency, racial sensitivity training, and stricter oversight of law enforcement. Eager to salvage public trust, the mayor invited state agencies and civil rights organizations like the NAACP to help craft new protocols for accountability. For Marcus Brown, life continued with a renewed sense of purpose. He had presided over multiple high-profile cases before, but none felt quite as personal as Rogers's. Despite the tension of that confrontation, he had maintained professional decorum throughout the trial. Some local journalists labeled him the equalizer, referencing how he had set a powerful example that anyone, judge or not, could confront institutional wrongdoing. In his personal life, Marcus found moments of quiet gratification. He would often chat with Miss Delphine, who regarded him with almost grandmotherly affection. She no longer had to worry about running into Rogers in some hallway. Parents in Pinebridge now voiced new hope that their children, especially black and brown youth, could drive through their own neighborhoods without fear of unjust harassment. The trial had sent a loud message. The old ways of selective policing were no longer welcome. Yet, Marcus also understood that the fight against systemic injustice was far from over. One case, even a major one, wouldn't magically fix every issue. There would still be officers resistant to change, officials who preferred the status quo, and cultural biases that lingered. But for now, Pinebridge was on a path of reform, and that was more than most small towns in similar situations could boast. Meanwhile, Wayne Rogers was transferred to a state correctional facility outside of Pinebridge. Rumors circulated that he had a hard time adjusting to prison life, stripped of the authority he once wielded. There were unconfirmed reports of him trying to bargain for leniency by offering more details on other crooked activities within the region. Whether those claims bore fruit or not, one thing was certain: he was paying the price for his arrogance and malfeasance. Marcus sometimes wondered if Rogers ever thought back to the day he pulled him over, unaware that the man in the driver's seat was destined to be the judge in his own corruption case. Life could be like that, weaving people's paths in unexpected ways. Marcus's father had always told him, "Treat every person with dignity, son. You never know which way the winds of fate might blow." Rogers's downfall was a testament to that wisdom. With the Rogers case concluded, Marcus turned his attention to the growing caseload on his desk: domestic disputes, property disagreements, minor criminal offenses. The day-to-day grind of administering justice continued, but his role in the Rogers trial still resonated, reminding him and everyone else that the bench was not just a seat of power, but a sacred trust to uphold integrity and fairness. The final word on Rogers came in a brief letter that arrived at the courthouse months later. It was from Rogers's attorney, announcing they would not pursue an appeal. The matter, at least legally, was closed. Marcus folded the letter with quiet satisfaction, filing it away. Justice had taken time, effort, and courage, but it had prevailed. Thank you for joining me on this intense journey through the heart of Pinebridge, where one officer thought he was above the law and learned the hard way that justice spares no one. The story of Judge Marcus Brown and Officer Wayne Rogers is a reminder that respect, decency, and the commitment to do what's right can topple even the most powerful walls of corruption. In a world where prejudice can overshadow the truth, it's crucial we stand together for accountability and fairness. If you found this story gripping, dramatic, and thought-provoking, please give this video a like and share it with your friends. Your support helps spread messages of courage and justice far and wide. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you never miss more powerful tales of real life and fictional heroes who step forward to fight for what's right. Thank you, and until next time, stay vigilant.